Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Bonjour et bienvenue. My name is Alex Gates, and I am the Executive Director and Curator at the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa, Ontario. On behalf of everyone at the museum, I'm glad you're able to join us on a snowy, wet December evening as we share Canada's automotive heritage. Tonight, we once again have participants registered from across Canada, and a special welcome to our followers in Australia and South Africa who aren't able to make our talks live, but watch our talks afterwards on YouTube. I'm glad to see many returning viewers as well as some new names on our registration list this evening. So if you haven't joined us before, welcome, welcome, welcome. To begin with, let me cover a few technical details. We are using the Zoom webinar platform. So as a participant, you are able to see us and the presentation, but all of your cameras and sound are off on your end. So you can sit back and relax this evening as we put on the show. Demeric Dupensier will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the evening, and we'll cover as many questions as possible following the presentation. If there's something we aren't able to get to, we can certainly follow up with you after the talk with the email address that you used to register. We will be recording this talk this evening, and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel next week, and a link will be available in our January e-newsletter and on our social medias. Following this talk, you'll receive a survey on this event. Your feedback is, of course, always appreciated. Our third Thursday series continues on January 19th. Our speaker is going to be Justin Sucrage, and he's going to be speaking on Canadian cars of the 1980s. Justin was our very first Third Thursday speaker way back in December 2020. He was speaking on the DeLorean back then, and we're excited to have him back. So thank you for Justin for kicking off 2023 with us. Who else can you expect to have on our series in 2023, you ask? Well, we're going to be talking about not only 80s cars, we're going to be talking about Studebaker Canada, the Brooks Steam cars, and we even have a special guest joining us from California speaking about Tesla. Is it Elon Musk? Well, you're going to have to tune in to find out, but the answer is probably no, but hey, wouldn't that be fun? Finally, thank you to our title sponsor, Hagerty, and in particular, our regional rep, Michael Wilson, and everyone who made a donation to the museum as part of your registration this evening. As always, it's greatly appreciated. And for all of those who have given for our annual fund drive at the end of the year, I really appreciate that as well. So thank you so much for your support of the museum here at the end of the year. Tonight, we are joined by two special guests from the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. We have Erin Gregory and Valerie Wood, who are both experts who are quite out of this world in terms of their transportation scope. So in particular, we connected with them with our Wires to Wheel exhibit as we discovered that electric vehicle technology really got a huge leg up during the space race. And so when we're looking at electric vehicles in the 60s and 70s, we can't really talk about modern electric cars without this connection to the need to not have to stop at a gas station when you're in outer space. So they're both experts in their field, and I'm really excited about this talk tonight. So Erin, Valerie, I will turn it over to you because I know you have an absolutely, I won't say out of this world again, but really great presentation planned for us tonight. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Erin Gregory, and I'm the curator at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. And I'm joined here by the assistant curator, Valerie Wood, obviously working at the same place. So we're going to begin our Kicking Up Moondust program by giving a little bit of history on this space program itself. Next slide. So in the beginning, in the before times, the NASA was created in October 1st, 1958. So this is very much a product of the Cold War. The original mission, this group, it's kind of hard to imagine now, but this group was actually very, very small at its inception. And its primary mission was just to put a man in space. That was the task. The space race had begun basically the year before with the successful launch and subsequent orbiting of the Earth of the Russian satellite Sputnik, which occurred basically exactly a year before the Space Task Group was formed. Bob Gilruth, the man you see here, basically conceived and managed a bunch of pioneering research programs in aeronautics for NACA, NASA's predecessor, before the space mandate was added. And he's basically considered the father of the US human spaceflight program. He was also, incidentally, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the man who hired a bunch of engineers, Canadian engineers from Avro when the Avro Arrow program was canceled. Next slide. So the first one was Project Mercury. And Project Mercury was all about, as I mentioned, putting a man in space. The race was on. The Soviets were obviously attempting to do the very same thing. They had already succeeded by this point in putting several animals into space with more or less success, depending on whose perspective you were thinking about it from. And they were obviously the first to put a man in orbit. This was obviously a great disappointment, but Alan Shepard became the first American in space on May 5th, 1961. And John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth almost a year later. Next slide. Around the same time, there was an investigation happening on whether or not women could also train to be astronauts. So the first lady astronaut trainees, otherwise known as the Flats, or now the Mercury 13, were also put through the exact same psychological and physiological tests as their Mercury 7 counterparts. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of political desire at the time to have women in space, and that program never really went anywhere beyond the testing phase. But it is worth noting that all of the women performed equally, if not better in some cases, than the male astronauts during the same testing. Next slide. So on May 25th, 1961, the space race really kicks off in a big way with JFK announcing that the US government will put a ton of resources, in particular financial resources, behind a moonshot. So the idea was, before the 60s were out, that they would land a man on the moon and bring him back safely to Earth. Now, this was pretty much the key part of this statement, was bringing that individual back. And that's where a great deal of kind of engineering technology and resources kind of went into, is this idea of returning them safely to Earth. He obviously mentions at the end of the statement that it will be an extremely difficult and expensive feat to accomplish, which it was. Next slide. So to this end, NASA hires a second group of astronauts, which are known as the New Nine. You'll see several familiar names, including Neil Armstrong and John Young in this list. Next. So Project Gemini, well, the Americans call it Gemini. I'm going to call it Gemini because Gemini sounds too weird. So I'm just going to go with that. Project Gemini was basically a proving ground for Apollo. So from here on out, essentially every single space mission can be thought of as a rung on the ladder to getting to the moon and back. At this point, the Americans are still very much behind in the space race. The Soviets are kind of beating them at every possible turn. The first EVA for the Soviets happened well before the Gemini 4, EVA by Ed White. But all of this changes with the Gemini 6 and 7 mission. So this is the first rendezvous in orbit. This kind of happened by accident and was sort of serendipitous, actually. But this kind of turned the tide for the US in terms of the space race. So they were able to perform a rendezvous of two orbiting spacecrafts. And that was obviously a pretty critical piece of the puzzle in terms of how they were going to actually get to the moon. Next. Apollo 1, this mission was actually originally known as AS-204. AS stands for Apollo Saturn. This tragedy occurred during a plugs out test at the Cape. All three astronauts were inside the command module, and it was basically an electrical short. There were sparks because the atmosphere in the command module at that time was 100% pure oxygen, it went up very, very quickly, and I mean the astronauts had no chance to get out. But even if they did have a few seconds, there was a problem with the hatch that wouldn't allow it to actually be opened from the inside, and even from the outside it took minutes to open it up, and by that time it was too late. So sadly, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee all perished, and that was January 27th, 1967. So this put a great strain on the space program, as you can imagine, and it took a while for the evaluation and the investigations to take place, enough to actually encourage people to get back to the moonshot. Next. So they pushed forward with Apollo 4, 5, and 6. These are pretty comprehensive tests of the spacecraft. There were no Apollo 2 and 3 missions. So we jumped right to Apollo 4. These tests basically were kind of again a bit of a proving ground, and basically just ensuring that everything is working properly before they actually put people back in, or attempt to put people back in space. The idea of losing more astronauts at this stage of the game, it was seen to be a real liability in terms of the public support for the space program and the future of the space program. Next slide. So with the success of 4, 5, and 6, there was enough confidence to launch Apollo 7 on October 11th, 1968. So these 3 astronauts were the first to return to space since the Gemini program. They were also the first to broadcast live on television from space. So they did several broadcasts over the course of their 10-day mission. Next slide. Apollo 8, this is the first crew that heads to the moon. So this was a very important step in the program, obviously. So you can get to the moon, orbit it, and return safely. This is also the first Christmas broadcast from space, I'll note. Next, Apollo 9, Spider and Gumdrop. These are kind of critical tests of the command module and the lunar module. Next. And then Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal. So this is, pretty much everything but an actual landing. And in fact, the lunar lander of this particular mission was not equipped with enough fuel to actually make a landing. I always like to point that out because there was, a bit of anxiety around the fact that potentially somebody might go cowboy on the whole thing and decide to just land and then circumvent the whole, the whole media circus that was planned around Apollo 11. Next. And of course, the final kind of step in the moonshot, Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin head out on July 16th, 1969. Next. And they arrive July 20th, 1969. Of course, Neil Armstrong's famous line. And I also kind of like to point out that it was, this is very interesting as a process anyways, but all of the cameras get set up before anybody does anything, right? So it's just like a very, everybody was very cognizant of this incredibly historic moment. So much so that even one Canadian connection that I do like to mention is that Aero DevTech, which is a company in Longueuil in Quebec, built the legs of the lunar lander, but the Americans were very, very particular about not allowing anybody but an American firm to build the feet, so that even, they knew that it was going to be an American astronaut to touch down on the moon, but they didn't even want anybody else's feet, so to speak, touching the moon surface before an American did. So anyway, I always laugh at that. Next. So working on the moon, they're collecting samples, taking photos, and setting up for future missions. Next. Apollo 12 and 14, the Moon Men. So these are the second and third mission to actually land on the moon. Not talking about Apollo 13, of course, which had its own set of disastrous events that didn't, or basically slowed down the space program quite a bit as they were making adjustments as a result. But Apollo 14 did return. Next. So the J missions. So Apollo 15, 16, and 17 have kind of a renewed focus on science. Next. So this becomes the primary emphasis of all the landing missions. Now they kind of sorted out the bugs of, how to get there, how to get back. The spacecrafts are working as expected. And so this focus on science is largely about extending stays on the moon, how long. So this is sort of the beginning of testing long duration space flight in outer space. The emphasis also included the addition of the Lunar Roving Vehicles, largely because they were looking to cover more ground, and that's part of staying on the moon longer as well. Next. Oh, there we go. Over to you, Valerie.
Thank you, Erin. So the idea of the moon vehicles had captivated science fiction writers from the beginning of the 20th century. And in fact, one of the engineers who managed the lunar roving project for NASA cited that the lunar vehicle in the 1901 book, A Silvery Globe, was partial inspiration for the project. But besides the science fiction potential, the idea of a lunar vehicle was incredibly useful, like Erin was saying, in terms of being like a practical tool for exploring the moon, and it allows astronauts to travel further across the moon's surface in their mission to study, collect lunar samples, and photograph the moon. So what eventually became the Lunar Roving Vehicle, or the moon buggy, used during Apollo 15, 16, and 17, went through extensive design and development throughout the 1960s that we're going to talk a little bit about. So an early lunar vehicle project at NASA began in '64 at the Marshall Center in Alabama with the development of the MoLab, or Mobile Laboratory. The MoLab was built by Grumman and consisted of a 3-ton closed cabin vehicle for 2 passengers that could travel 100 kilometers and act, as the name suggests, as a mobile scientific laboratory. The project was canceled with one of the main issues being the size and weight of the vehicle, which would have been very difficult to safely transport to the moon. So besides the MoLab, NASA experimented with various other lunar vehicles that were meant to walk, crawl, fly, or even jump across the moon's surface, which would have been quite a sight. But the research behind the MoLab and these other early lunar vehicles helped with the development of the eventual moon buggies that were used during the Apollo missions. On April 7th, 1969, Wernher von Braun, the first head of the Marshall Flight Center, announced the establishment of the Lunar Roving Task Team. The contract for the Lunar Roving Vehicle went to Boeing, and work started in 1970. Boeing worked from Alabama and Washington, and GM's Delco Electronics division in California worked as the major subcontractor, working primarily on the wheels. Even with these external contractors, engineers at the Marshall Center were still intimately involved with the project, especially the drive motors, battery system, and the vehicle's electronics. Additionally, the Marshall Center labs were used to design and test the navigation and deployment systems. So they built a lunar surface simulator at the center with rocks and craters to test drive the vehicles on, which is pretty cool. So the timeline on the project was incredibly limited, with the whole thing scheduled to take about 17 months. Then that's from initial development, which started in October of 1969, and then the delivery of the first moon buggy to Kennedy Space Center in April 1971. So in comparison, other manned space flight hardware took between 3 to 4 years to complete. So this was a really tight schedule. And to meet this tight deadline, different phases of the projects were developed in parallel with each other. So then as each task was completed, it was delivered to the next phase of the project, which would have already been underway. So design considerations. Driving on the moon poses many unique design considerations, including factoring in the lack of atmosphere, weak lunar gravity, about 1/6 of Earth's gravity, and many other unknown factors relating to lunar soil and the moon's topography. So like how wheels essentially were going to work on the moon. Additional considerations included how they were going to physically get the moon buggy to the moon, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. So bearing all of these considerations in mind, the final buggy consisted of a 2-person electric battery-powered vehicle that weighed about 460 pounds and could carry a maximum payload of 1,080 pounds. And this had to include both astronauts, their equipment, and various lunar samples that they picked up on their traverses. And the vehicle was designed for a top speed of 13 kilometers, but it did go up to 18 kilometers an hour during Apollo 17. So there were various major systems at play within the moon buggy, and I'll just quickly go through them. So the mobility system included the wheels, traction drive, suspension, steering, and drive control electronics, and that was designed by GM. The power system consisted of two 36-volt silver zinc batteries and 4 1/4 power electric motors that were individually powering each wheel. And with a harmonic drive unit connecting each motor to its wheel, the harmonic drive connected each motor to its wheel. So the navigation system allowed the astronauts to drive out of sight of the lunar module and return based on the most direct route, thanks to the directional gyro unit, which provided reference for calculating the heading, range, and bearing. And the communication system consisted of a television camera, radio, and telemetry equipment, which was supplied by RCA, and this allowed data to be transmitted to Earth from the moon buggy. And we'll return to the communication system in a little bit, as it has a fun Canadian connection. The thermal protection system protected the buggy from the extreme temperatures of the moon and helped to dissipate the heat generated by opening or operating the equipment, because the equipment had to be covered while in use because so much lunar dust was stirred up during this. So after each traverse on the moon, the equipment had to be unwrapped to let heat escape, and they had to brush off the dust before they could do that. So the crew station system was focused on being made as simple as possible for the astronauts to use, even though they had participated in the testing on Earth throughout the development of the buggy. Their first actual moon buggy ride was on the moon. So this system included the control and display console, the seats, the seat belts, armrests, footrests, hand and toe holds, floor panels, and fenders. And one interesting design feature included the lawn chair-esque seats of the moon buggy, which were made out of nylon and Velcro. A similar material was then attached to their life support systems on their back, so that they would kind of stick the chair to the astronaut, and so it helped them kind of stay in place a little bit better. The control and display system consisted of two parts. The upper part navigated the moon buggy, and the lower part monitored and controlled it. The power monitor included data on the batteries and motors, and included how much electricity was left in ampere hours. So here we've got some different photos of the buggy during different phases of development. So packing for the moon. The final system we'll talk about is the vehicle deployment system, also known as how the heck did they get the moon buggy to the moon? So the moon buggy traveled to the moon attached to the lunar module, which was the spacecraft that the astronauts used to travel between lunar orbit and the surface of the moon. They had to make the vehicle as small as possible, so they folded it up with the wheels against the chassis. They also kind of folded it in half. So the buggy was folded up into a cargo bay at the bottom of the lunar module and was deployed almost automatically through a system of pulleys, reels, ropes, and springs. So one astronaut was tasked with releasing the rover from the lunar module, and the second one would slowly reel it out of the cargo bay. And then the wheels unfolded themselves using springs. So once the buggy was deployed, and it was that meant it was pretty easy for the astronauts to move it around, because even though it was 460 pounds on Earth, it was only about 70 to 80 pounds on the moon, which is a lot lighter. So again, different photos of the buggy and how it kind of folded up on itself, and you can see the chevron pattern on the wheels, which helps give them kind of grip. So packing for the moon. Here we've got two animated videos by NASA that kind of show how it was packed up and then unpacked when it got there. They're not like perfect representations, but they give a good idea and I think help visualize it. So I'm gonna play it, and then if it doesn't work, Erin, could you tell me? So that's how it was rolled up, and here it is unpacked. Okay, perfect. So now back to you, Erin. You're muted.
Zoom bingo. Who had that one? So yeah, a quick overview of the moon buggy mission. So Apollo 15, as you mentioned, was the first of the J missions. David Scott and Jim Irwin become the first astronauts to drive on the moon, and just showing the utility of having the moon buggy missions. They covered 4 times more ground than all previous Apollo missions. So their main objective was to explore kind of a separate area of the moon, and take images of this particular crater. Apollo 16 happening slightly less than a year later. John Young and Charles Duke drive on the moon. So they're there for 3 hours and 17 minutes, and they go out 3 separate times. So as Valerie was saying, that everything that's going on in between these, the recharging of the batteries and then cleaning up the rover and then being able to go again. And this is why their stays on part of the reason the stays on the moon are much longer. So you're looking at multiple days of lunar residence. And Apollo 17 is the last of the Apollo missions. So Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt are the last ones to drive on the moon. And just a quick note of how many photos that they took. And this is why our understanding, or part of the reason why our understanding of the moon at this time was so much greater than it had been prior to the Apollo missions. The number of photographs and videos taken on the moon throughout the entire Apollo program is just astronomical, as we like to say. So yeah, here's just a couple of stats on the moon buggies. One thing I do like to mention too that a lot of people don't think about is the amount of artifact material, this being from museums is the kind of stuff that we like, but the actual artifacts left on the moon from these particular programs are just kind of incredible to think about. There is also a lot of garbage, which is unfortunate, but the three moon buggies are there obviously, as well as the bottom, the base of every lunar lander is still on the moon. So yeah, I won't go maybe over all this again. Next slide. Just mainly for the images, so you can just sort of get an idea of what it all looks like. And here, a motion picture. So this looks like some pretty impressive off-roading. I would say maybe more than a Grand Prix, but you can see how the design considerations, particularly related to the topography of the moon, are incredibly important. And you see that reflected in all of today's rover programs as well. It's just this idea of, going to these other planets, or in the case of the moon, the natural satellites, not knowing really what you're getting into when you go, in terms of the terrain, and the terrain is quite aggressive. So yeah, Apollo 17, again, the last one. The reason the Apollo programs kind of shut down at this point, there is a distinct lack of public interest sort of around these moon landings. Again, people don't quite, they're not quite as excited about it. They don't really understand why they keep returning. It's like, we've already done that, and that's it. So money was becoming an issue. And then also there was kind of a bit of a deviation in the focus of the space program. So now they were looking more toward actually creating space stations. So the Russians, again, were kind of moving forward on that, and the Americans felt that they needed to push forward on that as well. So at this particular point, they were very focused on the Skylab program. And then once this, the Skylab program, and also the Apollo-Soyuz rendezvous in space in 1975. And then after that, there's a move to the shuttles. So there just really wasn't much of a desire to return back into the moon until very recently.
So another video we have here is Apollo 17 taking off from the moon. I don't know why I put it in quotes. That's literally what it's doing. But the reason this is cool is that it was filmed from the moon buggy itself. So the camera that was on the buggy is what takes this video. So I won't do the volume, but we can just quickly.
And there they go. One thing I would like to point out about the ascent module for the lunar lander is that the engines that they had for ascent and descent were the only non-redundant systems on the spacecraft. So you really have one chance to get down and get up. There was a possibility of using, as was proved with Gemini 6 and 7, of using the command module to rescue the lunar module, but it was still dependent on that lunar module being able to get up that one time. So it's yeah, it was very risky.
So moving on to some surprising Canadian connections between Apollo, but more directly to the lunar rovers, we're going to talk about a few of those. So from Avro to Apollo, there's a lot of general connections between the Apollo program and really NASA as a whole to Canadians, and specifically Avro Canada engineers going to NASA post the cancellation of the Avro Arrow. So with the cancellation of the project in February 1959, many Avro Canada engineers left to work at NASA and were heavily involved in their early work, including the Apollo program and the development of the Lunar Roving Vehicle. So I'll just talk about a few. So here we've got John Hodge, who was born in England in 1929 and worked at Vickers Armstrong in the UK before emigrating to Canada and joining Avro Canada in 1952. Once at NASA, he became one of the first flight directors for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions. And in '68, he became head of the Johnson Space Center's Advanced Program Office, where he worked on preparing for the last 3 Apollo lunar landings. This included leading the working group that was dedicated to expanding the capacity of Apollo's lunar module, which allowed it to stay longer on the moon, to carry more equipment, such as the LRV, bring home more lunar samples, and to carry more scientific instruments to photograph and measure them. So the second Canadian who worked at NASA and on the Apollo program was Owen Maynard. Maynard was born in 1924 in Sarnia, Ontario, and was an RCAF pilot during the Second World War before receiving his aeronautical engineering degree from the University of Toronto and working at Avro Canada. He joined NASA in 1959 and was involved in the design of the Apollo command and lunar modules, and became the chief of systems engineering for the Apollo program in 1964. Maynard's group found that expanding the size of the tank allowed for the extra fuel needed to carry the LRV to the moon. I think these photos are so great. Okay, on to Canadian moonscapes. So as part of the Apollo astronauts training, they visited places on Earth that were similar to the moon in some way, as a way of teaching them about lunar geography and geology. This included 2 Canadian moonscapes. So we've got one in Suffield, Alberta in 1970. The crew of Apollo 15 and 11 other astronauts traveled to a Canadian Forces base testing ground to witness 450 tons of TNT exploding, which created an 86-meter wide crater, and they were able to examine that to gain a better understanding of what to expect around impact craters on the moon. So second, and this is one is pretty well known, is that in Sudbury, Ontario in 1971 and 1972, astronauts from Apollo 16 and 17 traveled to Sudbury to train for these missions. And Sudbury was used as it allowed astronauts to study the geological features that were similar to those that they were going to find on the moon. So for the Apollo 16 training sessions, the astronauts did a mock moonwalk while they were there. And they wore mock equipment, but had real cameras, as you see in the photos. And even though what they found on the moon was going to be a very different experience from what their somewhat laid-back trip to Sudbury, the training did have an effect on them. And the next clip is astronaut John Young, mentioning Sudbury on the moon, which is very cool. But it's going to take me a second to set up the sound. So let me know if you can hear this.
Well, it is hot out here today, I'll tell you. You gonna give me a hand with this rig sample, Charlie, or you want me? Yeah, if you can stand by just a minute, John. Charlie, describe this boulder right here to you. You describe this one with the black streak running through it? No. Boy, that is absolutely beautiful. It has a black fracture pattern running right through the middle of it. It's about 6. It looks like a Sudbury breccia, and that's the truth.
Oh, I think that's so good. If you watch more videos and interviews from their time when they were in Sudbury, they talk about how it was easier to train them to be scientists than it was to train scientists to be astronauts, which I think is kind of funny. But yeah, that video it's really cool to think that Canada and Sudbury specifically were mentioned on the moon. And you can find these videos on YouTube if you want to watch. So another Avro Canada connection to the moon buggy was the development of the Lunar Communications Relay Unit, or the LCRU, which was part of the communication system. So one issue that arose with the buggy is that it would be traveling out of sight of the lunar module, which meant that it needed special communications to keep the astronauts in touch with Earth. So the LCRU solved this issue by keeping them in communication with Earth, but it also permitted TV transmissions to be transmitted back to Earth using a color TV camera mounted on the buggy itself. And you can see that in the image. And the Canadian connection here is that Norman Farmer, who was born in London, England, but was an electrical engineer for NASA for 20 years, and before that was another Avro Canada employee, was part of the group of people that designed the LCRU. And he was the person that came up with the name LCRU, which apparently people thought sounded too much like crew, and they thought it would be confusing, but the name stuck, and I've said it like 20 times. So in this photo, you can see the high gain dish antenna in the diagram, which astronauts aimed at Earth using a special sight that was developed by Farmer's group. And the sight would project Earth onto a small screen when they aimed the antenna correctly. The TV camera was operated from Houston, which allowed the video footage to be transmitted back to Earth while the astronauts drove across and explored the moon. And we saw an example of that video footage with the Apollo 17 takeoff. And apparently they had tried that same thing with Apollo 15 and 16 as well, but for some reason the video didn't work until 17. So luckily we have that. Okay, so turning to the future of Canada on the moon. And this is just a really cool image of the Space Launch System rocket that was used for Artemis 1 and the Peace Tower in Ottawa, and just kind of seeing that they're about the same height. And that kind of, I think, gives a good idea of how big these rockets actually are, or I guess if you know rockets, it tells you how big Canada's parliament is. So the Artemis program, Canada will continue to be part of lunar exploration, especially through the Canadian Space Agency's connection to NASA's Artemis program, which plans to put humans back on the moon for the first time since Apollo 17 in 1972. And yeah, the one connection that we're kind of living through is that the 50-year mark is this week. So it's really cool to think that we were there 50 years ago and now we're going back now. So the Artemis program will start with 3 missions. Artemis 1 was an uncrewed test flight of the Orion spacecraft and was launched on the Space Launch System rocket from Kennedy Space Center on November 16th and landed earlier this week on December 11th after orbiting the moon. And of course, it's interesting to note that December 11th also marked 50 years since Apollo 17 actually launched in 1972. So Artemis 2 is scheduled for May 2024, and it will perform a lunar flyby test and then return to Earth. It will be the first crewed flight of the Orion spacecraft, and it will include 4 astronauts with 1 Canadian astronaut aboard. Artemis 3 is then scheduled for 2025, and will be the first crewed lunar landing since 1972, and it plans to put the first woman and first person of color on the moon. Canada is also supporting the Artemis program and lunar exploration through the Lunar Gateway, which is a planned space station in lunar orbit. Canada will be contributing Canadarm3 to the Gateway. Canadarm3 will be a highly advanced robotic system that will support human and robotic lunar missions, and it will feature a large and small robotic arm capable of performing maintenance and scientific jobs. And then this image was taken on November 20th, and it shows the side of Orion with the moon in the background. And somebody from work was saying how it's Orion taking a selfie of itself, which I thought was really funny. And so returning to rovers, besides the Artemis program, Canada is still very much involved in lunar exploration and has plans to send a Canadian-built rover to the moon as early as 2026. Built by Canadensis, this rover will land on the moon's south pole and explore a polar region of the moon. The lunar rovers are unmanned and allowed for similar exploration and scientific data gathering as Apollo's moon buggies. This lunar rover will carry 6 scientific payloads. 5 of those will be Canadian and 1 American. So it will gather imagery, measurements, and data from the moon's surface and hopes to find lunar water to help understand lunar geology and the environment. Another goal for this Canadian lunar rover is to survive 2 lunar days and a lunar night, which doesn't sound too hard, except that actually equals 42 days on Earth. And then to add insult to injury, lunar nights last 14 Earth days and are very, very dark and cold, which poses a lot of technological problems for the lunar rover. And this is just a mock-up from a CSA video. That's not the actual rover, but it gives a good idea of kind of what it's going to be up against. And then finally, Erin, do you want to talk about rovers we've got at CAS?
Sure. We've got a couple rovers, some in the collection, some on loan from the Canadian Space Agency. Mainly what we look at with the rovers is that they're all equipped with certain scientific payloads in order to perform the tasks on the missions that they are assigned to. But the main considerations with rovers actually revolve around wheels. So you can see how different some of these wheels are. If you look at other examples of the Mars rovers, for example, like those are all kind of works in progress to figure out exactly what the best means of traversing this type of terrain. Effectively, these rovers travel in like, the slowest possible increments. So as you're watching them, this is like kind of like watching paint dry to get them to move, but it's just within the Mars case in particular is because of the delay, right? So if anything comes up, you would need to stop it well in advance. Otherwise, you're going to lose the rover, and that's kind of kills your program. The delay with lunar communication is only about 8 seconds, and so there may be a possibility that the lunar rovers will travel a little bit faster. So Canadian Drive and Gear created this lunar rover prototype, the Argo J4, and we have that on display at the museum currently. So their wheels looking very different from the Rex rover, which is this picture on my right, the Robot Explorer. This is effectively like what they would call the grandfather of rovers that are kind of being created and utilized today, and that is mainly about its wheels. So the chassis itself and the scientific instruments that it is carrying, there are certain things that I wouldn't even really call them remarkable because it's pretty standard, but the wheels sort of make the rover, I guess, is sort of what I'm trying to say.
That pretty much sums everything up. Thank you, everybody. And if you want to come visit those rovers or us, you can find us at the Canada Aviation Space Museum, or you can email us if you're a little far away.
Thanks so much, Erin Gregory. Erin and Valerie. So sorry. Thank you so much. That was amazing.
You're welcome.
You guys have really dug up some really absolutely fascinating photos and video. So everybody in the audience, please, if you have any questions, use the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask them. But I guess I'd start off with one that's been kind of not bugging me, but I'm curious about. One of the things that's always stuck with me, growing up watching video of the moon landing, is how sort of clumsy and awkward the suits were. I think there's that famous footage of one of the astronauts dropping a shovel or something and kind of having to go do a push-up to pick it back up. How did that affect the controls? How do you drive a vehicle wearing a giant suit?
Well, not having had that experience myself, I can only assume that to be honest, I kind of feel like the buggy would be easier to deal with than just using your own body and then using these, because beyond the suits themselves, the suits themselves are awkward, they're pressurized, so you're kind of working against your own spacecraft effectively every time you're doing anything. So one of the things that people don't realize is even today's spacesuits, which are still quite bulky and that, but that people who do spacewalks around the ISS, after 5 to 7.5 hours of working in these pressurized suits, they end up with bruises and blisters on their fingers just from that, just because of the pressurization of the suit itself. So I kind of have a feeling that when you're actually in the buggy, so long as you're there and kind of secure, that actually might be easier to do, because there's not as much fine motor movement as there is when you're picking up samples of rocks, for example.
And did it have a sort of a conventional steering wheel pedal setup? I obviously, you're not shifting gears or anything, but how
No,
how did
it had a T-shaped kind of handle to hold, and they were able to go forward and backwards and side to side with that. So I think that also contributes to, well, I'm sure it was still very, very difficult, but the ease of use is they went with that design to make it as easy as possible to be driven on the moon.
Yeah. And also for packing, right? Anything in that kind of configuration is much easier to fold up.
Now, you mentioned that they didn't like obviously they didn't have a chance to fully practice driving the actual buggy on Earth because it was too lightweight and too fragile. But are there any surviving sort of practice or test vehicles out there?
Yeah, they have some of the ones that they practice on at, well, unfortunately, not at our museum, but at others. And they did get to practice on like trainers at Marshall Space Flight Center, but that wasn't the yeah, like you said, it's not the actual one. And the trainers had, like, for example, they were very similar, but for example, they used different types of batteries and stuff. So they weren't like exactly the same, but very close, and they were able to kind of test against those. Like they built those kind of craters and stuff to kind of mimic what it was going to be like.
So there's no evidence of these rover test beds ever being used in Canada. The Sudbury trips were on foot mostly.
Yeah, they were on foot.
The idea would be that you use the buggy to get to the craters, because you don't necessarily want to land the lunar module too close to the edge of a crater, because that is very risky. You want your landing field to be as flat as possible. So being able to access them is really just is about that. So you drive over, but you are going to be doing this kind of geological work on foot. So that makes sense for the analog missions to mirror that.
We've got a comment from Allison who's saying, amazing that electric vehicles could be used on the moon before their widespread usage on Earth. And I have to interject because we've been working on exhibits about this for the past year. They were more widespread than you think, Allison, but that's a talk for another time. Dennis wants to know, what state are the buggies that are left behind on the moon in now? Are they in working order? Could they be recharged?
My guess is no. The long-term effect of the cold on the battery would be something to consider, certainly. However, if you were able to show up with a replacement, you might be able to get things going again. The other thing to note is that the moon is often subject to micrometeorite strikes, to actual meteor strikes, things like that. So, I mean, who knows what kind of dust and everything has settled on them over the last 50 years. So my guess is that it would take quite a bit to get them in working order again.
I was reading something interesting about the batteries too, also that their life cycle was like good enough for what they needed up there, but because they were going to the moon, they had to like put into like a heat chamber or I don't know if it was a chamber, but heat them up to kind of kill anything before taking them to the moon, and that also kind of decreased the lifespan of the battery. So I think putting it through like extensive heat, and then like Erin was saying, put it through extensive cold, the chances are pretty low.
Certainly in our own research on nickel silver powered batteries like they used on the moon rovers, lots of commercial firms on Earth tried to use nickel silver batteries for electric cars and found that they were very sort of very finicky and temperature sensitive and didn't have a very long lifespan. So that would absolutely track.
Yeah.
Clark is wondering, was corrosion an issue? Did they have to worry about anything like that? And I guess not quite rust, they weren't out there for long enough, but what kind of conditions were these having to deal with other than obviously the lack of an atmosphere?
My guess is that corrosion wasn't a concern because of the short stay and also the lack of moisture on the moon just in general. So I think the kind of cold, arid environment on this atmosphereless planet, and then the fact that these really only needed to be used for 3 days, it wouldn't have been a concern at that time.
And I certainly know that one thing you sort of hear a lot and see a lot in stories from the lunar astronauts is how dusty everything got, and how the lunar dust was that like sticks to everything. Was that a concern with the vehicle, that it could get gummed up kind of?
Yeah, and that's why they kind of wrapped it up. The different kind of systems that needed to stay protected were wrapped up. And then again, when they stopped, they would brush everything off, and they brought brushes up to do this. And then they could open it up to kind of let the heat dissipate or whatever, like kind of check on what was happening. Another story about the lunar rovers that make me think of dust is, I'm forgetting which mission. It was one of the three. The fender broke off, so they had like maps that they had brought up to use. And they used the map to kind of make a fender, and they clipped it on, and then that worked perfectly, like well enough. But again, those got, like, because of all the dust kind of being kicked up by the wheels and stuff. So that was like important enough to add that back on. And those, but because they clipped them on, they were able to take them off and bring them back down to Earth. So that's kind of a cool piece of rover history on Earth, even though we couldn't bring the real thing back.
Clark is asking again if there's sort of concerns about skidding and slipping in terms of how they design the power to weight ratios, the engines, but then also I guess the wheels themselves. Could you? I know the lunar rover wheels are like, you could do a seminar just on those wheels. They were so weird and out there. Could you tell us more?
Do you want to speak, or you want me to go, Erin?
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just trying to think if it's worth maybe pulling up another image, but I think it might take too long. But the wheels themselves, to speak on them, I think you could kind of see in some of the photos, but they're mesh wire, like hollow mesh wire. Well, not completely hollow, but you can kind of see through them. And then on top of that, they had those kind of covered about 50% of the wheel, the chevron pattern of like steel plating on it to kind of help with the grip and stuff. And I think it was really a concern that they were going to kind of slip and slide everywhere. But from my research, it ended up actually not being quite as bad as they thought, and they weren't sure how deep they were going to sink into the moon itself, or kind of fly over the top of it. But yeah, so they didn't sink even as, I think, much as they thought they were going to. But yeah, I'm sure the turning wasn't quite as easy as it is to do on Earth.
Could you maybe bust a myth for me? I could have sworn that I heard this somewhere as a kid and stuck in me years, that at the start, or like the very last minute on Apollo 11, there was a camp at NASA who were still completely convinced that when they landed, they would sink into the moon like quicksand.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was an ongoing concern, just because nobody knew what the terrain was going to be like. So when you see the pads, the feet of the lunar lander, they were made like saucers, and they were quite wide. And the idea was to disperse as much weight as possible, because they really didn't know what how that was going to go. And then also the landing of Apollo 11 too was quite a bit further in than they had anticipated, right? So the subsequent Apollo missions actually practiced doing like pinpoint landings and stuff, but Apollo 11 was, because there was a few alarms going off and that sort of thing, and then when they actually approached where they thought they were going to land, it was actually quite a bit rockier than was optimal, so they had to kind of blow past it and try to set down somewhere that was more favorable while watching their fuel gauge tick 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 tick, right? So that was obviously problematic and stressful.
An interesting comment from Dennis. He's saying one of the Apollo buggy drives visited one of the earlier landing sites, not sure which, and retrieved some of the pieces of the previous vehicle to study their erosion effects. And then apparently there was a big flap over it at NASA when they brought them back to Earth, because the engineers basically claimed the pieces from the science team and wouldn't let the science team study them, because it was, oh, this is an engineering matter. Oh,
well, I don't know about that part, but I do. Apollo 15 did go back and visit a probe a previous attempt to study the moon's orbital as uncrewed, obviously. But yeah, the idea was to go back and look at that just to see, because it had been on the moon for several years at that point. So they wanted to see what the impact was.
So this is maybe more, I guess, not speculative, but I know that there were lots of plans right after Apollo ended for sort of, what to keep doing with Saturn V rockets, or, hypothetical ideas for what an Apollo 19 or 20 might have looked like. Were there any future plans for, we have these lunar rover designs, what could we use them for next? Did that ever continue in any way?
There were plans for Apollo up to at least 19, as far as I know. And you can see actually the lunar lander that was slated for Apollo 19 is on display at the Aviation Museum in Long Island. So that's where Grumman was, and where they were being built. But I'm not actually sure if they were going to continue with the buggy. My assumption is yes, because it allowed them to cover so much more ground, and it was practical. And you could see, the way it was packed up on the side. If the lunar module is already designed for that, then it just makes sense to kind of continue with that. That would be my assumption. I don't know 100%, but yeah.
I also know that the MOLAB that we looked at the beginning of the presentation, that was kind of kitted out to be used for different on Earth applications as well. So it worked for that, but it wasn't able to go to the moon.
So then, go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to jump in. We have just a couple of minutes left. So if anyone else has any questions, shoot them into the Q&A, because you have your space experts here. I just want to wrap up with one fun one. What's your favorite conspiracy theory about the moon that you get questioned about? Because we get all sorts of weird questions at the Automotive Museum, and I'm sure you guys, there's a few hilarious ones. So
Alex, it's funny you say that, because I told Erin before this presentation that I was going to go rogue and start spitting out conspiracy theories and just see what happens. But no, you go first, Erin.
I'm gonna have to mute and shut her down quickly. Yeah, I guess just the idea of faking the moon landing in general, I do find pretty hilarious. And I have talked to a couple of moon landing deniers in the past, and they're an interesting bunch. It's funny, all these things that there's counterpoints for every single thing that they say, but there's no possible way of convincing these folks that this actually happened, right? It's interesting. But even just the knowledge that how many people would have to keep that secret, right? For that long, it just blows my mind that there's no possible way, right? It just couldn't happen. People can barely keep a secret about anything that's happening even in their office for 5 minutes, never mind this, right? So there's that. But then also, so this is why I kind of like, when I go through the history of the moon landing, I like to talk about all of the missions that happened before, so that people can see that this was not just oh, let's just put somebody on the moon and then it happens. It's not that at all. There were so many steps on the way to making that happen, and all of them presented with unique scientific and engineering challenges that were all kind of sorted out through this. And ultimately people lost their lives in pursuit of this, right? So it's anyway, but it is amusing in some ways. Valerie, you got a favorite one?
I haven't had anyone come up to me and try to tell me that the moon landing was fake, but if I do, I'll let you know in the next talk. But yeah, no, I think you speak really well on it, Erin. It's true that it would
give them my number.
It'd be pretty. Yeah, I'll have them come to your office.
Well, great. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us tonight. I have 8 o'clock on my end here. So do you have any final words or any anecdotes? I know when I give talks, I always have things that pop into mind. I just want to end with that. Any facts or stories you want to end up with?
Fun story. Well, one thing I will say, just because we didn't get too much of a chance to talk about it, but that beyond some of the connections that Valerie put forward, so the Space Task Group, which I mentioned at the very, very beginning, was a really small outfit when it started. And when the Avro Arrow program was canceled, they hired about close to 30 Avro engineers. 12 of them were natural born Canadians, and then others were expats from the UK. And went down. But when they did go, they actually made up 1/3 of the space task group. So you can imagine the level of contribution that these engineers made to the space program. And Bob Gilruth, who I also mentioned at the time, is known to have said that the cancellation of the Avro Arrow is the best thing that ever happened in NASA. So.
I don't have anything other than that. I have really enjoyed getting to talk about driving on the moon, but if I'm honest, I don't really even enjoy driving on Earth, so I don't think I would. I don't think I would be suited to drive on the moon. But thank you.
Oh, well, thanks for joining us. And for those of you watching, we look forward to having you join us in January when we're going to be back on Earth talking about the 1980s, because, you know, why not? It'll be January, it'll be cold. We're going to talk about some awesome cars and some really ugly cars. So it's going to be quite a trip. So look forward to seeing everyone in January. Thank you both for joining us, and have a good evening, everyone.